there's a difference between how much are you going to need from a gross standpoint or how much you're going to need net after tax, and that's an important distinction to make.
Oh man, so this one gets me going a little bit because it's such a big decision for people to make.
Generating income in retirement, and is this enough? What would you say to somebody on the street if you had kind of an elevator pitch to give them?
Welcome to Retirement Done Right with your hosts, David Rath and Pat Kalish, where we talk about retirement, social security, taxes, estate planning, wealth planning, and more. Now, onto the show.
$1 million, is that enough to retire? The age-old question is going to be answered on today's episode, where we bring in a special guest, our colleague, Andrew Heuss, who's our director of growth. He's going to play the moderator for this conversation between me and Pat. Andrew, welcome aboard.
Thanks, guys. I'm in the background all the time editing stuff, so it's kind of fun to be in the front end a little bit, seeing how it all works.
So as I mentioned, I think the $1 million number gets thrown around a lot just because it's a nice round number, and I don't think it's been adjusted for inflation since this question started being asked. I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years ago, however many years it was. But the underlying principles of this question, I think, are timeless, and it is a question that we answer all the time. And Pat, in your work, you're constantly running these estimates and running these projections for people to answer the question, am I going to have enough to live on? So $1 million is the placeholder for this conversation, but it doesn't change the fact that when somebody enters into retirement, their main question is, am I going to have enough for retirement? So Andrew, as the moderator, I know you have some pre-prepared questions for us. Why don't you kick us off with some questions just to get the conversation going?
Yeah, I think it's a big transition, not only behaviorally but also financially. Like, it's pretty hard to unretire. Once you've kind of committed, it's pretty hard to take off, the retirement hat and put back the work hat on. And so, Pat, when it comes to retirement, we get questions all the time with taxes, income, and Social Security. What's the biggest thing to even think about when it comes to first, worrying about, can I retire? Is this enough? What backers should I take into place? What's kind of your first mental hurdle you have to go through to even think about that?
Wow, hit me with a tough question to begin.
We're starting off hot.
Oh yeah, no, we are starting off hot here. All right, the first question that I really think through, that's tough because it's such a broad topic. You know, while we're on the topic of is $1 million enough to retire, the one thing that I always like to discuss with clients before they kind of officially retire is like, what does lifestyle actually look like? And I think a lot of times, like, that is going to predicate whether or not they're ready to retire based upon their investments and their stable sources of income. And I bring that up because, if you have $1 million, you may be able to retire. That might be able to generate the income stream that you need, but it all depends on your lifestyle. It all depends on how much you're actually looking to be able to spend. So I always like to have conversations with client of like, what does comfort look like? Right. And like, what does your retirement lifestyle look like? I would say for the broad majority of our clients, it's just maintaining their current standard of living, maybe throwing in like an extra trip or two, but it's not like they're going to totally just change up their life, want to buy, an expensive sports car, and then, take 3 or 4 or 5 trips to Europe. So really, that's where I start. It's like, what does your retirement lifestyle look like? How do you define comfort within retirement? And then in that way, we can try and back into what is the income stream that you're going to need to be able to live that lifestyle, and then start to bring in all the other aspects that go along with a retirement income plan.
And that's always been my objection to this question to start with. Like, can you retire with $1 million and be okay? Like, yes. The real question is, do you want to live a lifestyle that is supported by that $1 million? And is an important distinction because I went through my college years living off of ramen noodles and day old pizza on pretty much a shoestring budget. So can you make it work? Absolutely. Do you want to live that kind of lifestyle? That's a different discussion. And do you want to make sacrifices to limit your spending to make that $1 million sufficient to meet what you're looking to accomplish in your retirement years? So can you do it? Absolutely. Do you want to? That's a different question. And that's where we come into play as far as what sort of lifestyle are you looking to lead in retirement? And do you have enough money to make that happen?
Amen to that.
And something Pat and I talked about before the recording actually started is lifestyle, like we guys talked about, but also where you live. Like I'm out of Minneapolis right now, and $1 million in Minneapolis does not go as far as say like Des Moines, Iowa, where my parents are retired. Like the cost of living is such a huge bump. And so $1 million retired here, you're gonna have a totally different lifestyle than $1 million in maybe the middle of nowhere, Texas, or some on the East Coast, West Coast. Every spot's going to be different. And you're going to take in a few different factors in what you want. And one other thing we should touch on too is that is $1 million enough to retire? Most people don't want to take a pay cut when they retire. If they make 60 grand a year per person, maybe they make 100 grand a year as a household, or 120 grand a year as a household, make 60 apiece. They don't want to take a pay cut when they retire. Can they generate that previous income with the retirement? It's a big factor that most people don't want to take a pay cut with. And Pat, you probably talk more about this. I would assume most people come in and say, I want to at least match or make more in retirement than previously. Is that right or no?
It's right. So let me bring this up too. I'm glad you brought up geography because it kind of jogged my memory. That's a huge one because we have dealt with some clients that, they might be living in upstate New York, and they want to move closer to kids or grandkids. And geography is huge because heck, you might have been able to leverage this specific, source of income in upstate New York. But if you move to say California, that income stream goes far, less. So that's a huge one. I love that you brought that up. In terms of taking a cut in terms of your income come retirement, that's another big one. But I also try and really get into the conversation with clients of you might not be spending like as much. You're not working, so you're not contributing to say your retirement accounts. You might not be commuting as much. You might not have to buy different things that you used to have to buy for work. So those things, like what I do find is sometimes people spend a little less in retirement. They might spend a little bit more out of the gates due to like travel, but that tends to taper off. So having those discussions about lifestyle and how expenses may change is such a crucial part of the conversation that we try and unpack so that they have confidence in knowing, hey, this is the number that I need, and my portfolio is going to be able to support that number.
Pat, do you have any rules of thumb when it comes to this? Obviously, different situations dictate different conversations, but if somebody's just like quick back of the envelope math, I want to know like how much I should live on based on my current salary while I'm working. Do you have any rules of thumb that you use?
Yeah, for pre-retirees, like when we're having the conversation, typically say like 70, 80%. I tend to be a little bit more conservative and go with 80% to basically factor in just a little bit more of a buffer. But I think that's a good rule of thumb to start off with those that are just like thinking about this lofty goal of retirement and they're still working towards it. How about you, David?
It depends if we're talking pre-tax or after tax and like because they're going to need to fund their lifestyle with after-tax money. And so as you mentioned, if you take let's say somebody's making $100,000 a year in their job, they're no longer going to be contributing to their retirement accounts. So that could be 10 or 15%. That's right off the top. Then there's also taxes, federal and state, that aren't going to be factored into the after-tax need for their household. And so you might end up with, in that example, $60,000 a year, $50,000 a year, again, depending on your situation and what life looks like, as that after-tax need based on your current starting salary. So there's a difference between how much are you going to need from a gross standpoint or how much you're going to need net after tax, and that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, heck yeah. I always like when we're running these longer term projections and when we're talking about retirement income streams, I try not to even bring up like, here's the pre-tax gross amount. I'm always talking in after tax numbers. And I even try and break it down as opposed to like, okay, this is how much I'm gonna need annually. It's like, how much do you need monthly? Because I find that a lot of the people that we work with tend to think like, okay, they have a better handle of their monthly after tax budget than they do, call it their annual budget, because those things can tend to evolve and change over time.
Your clients have a handle on their budget. That's nice.
But while we're talking about it, let me bring this up. I worked with a lot of clients that use credit cards, but they use them smartly. So they basically say like, okay, I put everything on a credit card and then I pay it off monthly. I actually love that. Not only for like the cash back or maybe the airline miles, but also a credit card is a great way to understand your budget. If you put the majority of your expenses on a credit card, you could pull up that statement at the end of the month, and that gives you a pretty good idea of how much you're spending on a monthly basis. So I'm all for credit cards if you use them wisely.
And I asked that question jokingly because I'm probably outing myself as a member of the financial services profession, but I have rough ideas about how much we spend, but there's things that come up every single month that are outside of my quote unquote budget. And so if I were sitting in front of a financial planner and they were asking me how much I spent on a monthly basis, embarrassingly, I probably wouldn't be able to answer that question accurately.
I live in cash flow statements. Now we don't have kids, so I will say that. So maybe our budget's a little bit more steady. But I'm always talking to Alyssa. I'm like, oh, run the cash flow this year, and I know exactly how much we're gonna need. So
Yeah, just wait till you spend $100 for two stuffed animals that build a bit.
yeah, I'm not there yet. It's gonna pain me, but as long as the kids are happy, I guess.
One thing you guys touched on briefly earlier was the taxation, different taxable accounts, like either, pre-tax, after-tax, Roth. And Pat, can you touch on quick? And there's a huge difference between if I have $1 million in a pre-tax 401k when I retire versus if I have maybe even $500,000 in a pre-tax and $500,000 in a Roth. That's a huge disparity. I mean, either 20 or 30% taxable amount difference. Can you go through what that might mean for somebody who's retiring, where their tax allocation is?
Yeah. So let's break it down. So if you are, say, retiring with a traditional IRA or a 401k, it's all funded with pre-tax money. What you have to remember is that when you take distributions from those pre-tax accounts, 100% is going to be taxable. So like David mentioned, it's always good to factor in those taxes and actually know where you stand in terms of your current tax bracket so that you could plan for that haircut that you're going to be able to send to, call it, Uncle Sam. The other thing that I'll mention is if you have some more tax diversification, which I think is just as important as investment diversification, then you can really be able to be a little bit more strategic in terms of how you're generating that income stream. So you might take a portion from your pre-tax assets, but say you're going to maybe bump up into the next tax bracket. You might be able to use some taxable money or some Roth money to keep you within your current tax bracket. And then in that way, you're keeping kind of more in your pocket and you're sending less to the IRS because a lot of those assets are taxed differently, or like Roth IRAs, they're not taxed at all. So it's extremely important to kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about your own nest egg on what do I have? How is it taxed? And how is that going to affect my after tax income, which I will actually have in my pocket ready to spend?
And that's a great point, Andrew, because $1 million in a Roth account can go a much longer way than $1 million in a pre-tax account. And so if somebody's asking that question, my first question would be, where do you hold this money? And are you going to owe taxes on it? Because $1 is not going to be the same in one account versus the other. So I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember, but there used to be a commercial for, I think it was ING, where these people would walk around with what they called the number, their number. It was like this giant, like, orange number that they had $1.2 million or whatever. And that was, quote unquote, the number that they needed to retire. And their financial advisor who worked at that institution would tell them exactly how much they needed. And unfortunately, the point of that commercial missed some of the nuances that we're discussing here as far as taxes and investment allocation and so many other things that go into what that number could be. So obviously it worked because it's stuck in my mind for the last 20 years, but I think it's important to have the conversation, and that's where we step in and we talk about a variety of factors that are going to play into how much money somebody's going to need.
Yeah.
We can keep this pretty high level because this is probably a whole different podcast in itself. But David, when you're looking at a portfolio, how would you trade maybe somebody had most of their money in a pre-tax account versus how would you trade and allocate and look at somebody who has most of their money in an after-tax account or Roth account? Do you manage that differently? Do you think about that differently? How does that whole kind of mental process work for retirement asset allocation?
I'm glad you asked because I've always found it funny when people say if you have a Roth account, then you just buy stuff that's going to grow more. Um, if you knew that ahead of time, you just put your whole portfolio into the stuff that's going to grow more. Like there's not an easy answer to that. So, of course, in a perfect world, you're allocating your higher growth stuff to a Roth account and then your quote unquote lower growth stuff. And we're not talking about stocks and bonds. Obviously, stocks have a higher expected return with more volatility, but they have a higher expected return. I'm talking about the distinction that people are making where you want to put your higher flyers into your Roth. Well, they could also lose money, and then you're kind of working in the opposite direction to that. So, if somebody has a mixture of accounts, typically what we do is we're smart in asset location from a tax standpoint, and maybe putting things that are going to generate income and be taxed as income in a tax deferred account because tax deferred money is going to be taxed as income anyway. So that's one area that we can work to mitigate some of the tax burden in a client's account. But I don't necessarily look at pre-tax or Roth as separate entities as far as like where I'm trying to achieve the highest growth. I want the highest growth in the portfolio, of course, with some risk constraints, but I don't want to try to beat the game and beat the system by by supercharging the Roth for growth because otherwise, then you're saying that you know more than what the market does at that point in time.
Yeah. I I love that approach too. And David and we've talked about this a lot. But also like when you're thinking about tax bracket management come retirement, say things happened in your life and you're like filling up, let's call it the 22% bracket, or let's call it the 12% bracket for sake of conversation.
When you say filling up, Pat, just explain to the audience what that means.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about like stable sources of income, when you're thinking about any like pre-tax distributions, meaning like you're in the 12% bracket. And by filling it up, you're basically topping off that bracket, but you're not going any higher. You're not then going from 12 into 22%. So you're not getting that additional 10% in terms of tax. So if, say, for example, like things happened and you are right at that 12% mark, where if you have any additional taxable income, it might bring you into 12 and 22%, then you can use the Roth at that point as an account to be able to try and keep yourself within your current tax bracket. But if your Roth was overloaded on, say, more riskier investments, and that took a haircut due to market volatility, and it doesn't feel as good to be able to pull money out of that Roth. So I appreciate the way that you approach the portfolios, David, because from a financial planner standpoint, if things happen in someone's life, we can actually just have a little bit more of a succinct process to manage their taxes, to manage their retirement income stream while having those robust risk controls within the whole portfolio.
And to your earlier point, the diversification amongst tax brackets is so underrated because
So
you don't know what the future is going to hold from an investment standpoint, from a tax standpoint, and you actually don't want to be on all pre-tax or even all Roth. And that's another discussion because that's at a certain point, it doesn't make sense to convert or it doesn't make a sense to put money into a Roth if you're in a lower tax bracket. And at some point, there is going to be a tipping point where it makes more sense to keep some in pre-tax. And so having that diversification across different tax buckets allows you to be flexible, allows you to adapt to whatever life throws at you, whether it's a down market, whether it's higher tax brackets. Having that flexibility allows you to adapt your own process and the strategy that you're employing at that given moment in time.
yeah, I think a good financial plan is one that continues to evolve. You have flexibility, and you have like choice. So it allows you to make different strategic decisions in order to craft that income stream. And by having tax diversification, like you have that flexibility, you have those potential choices to be more strategic in how you're sourcing your income. So I couldn't agree more.
David, it's funny that you brought that up with you view it as a whole, because I talked to an advisor probably 4 years ago, and he's always like, well, I was really conservative in people's IRAs, but really aggressive people's Roth because you don't pay taxes on it. And I always thought to myself, it was funny because I'd actually rather pay tax on 13% in my IRA than if we only made 6%. And it just didn't make sense to me from a financial perspective, but he was very, very dialed in on like, we only invest conservatively in IRAs. Do you see that a lot with portfolios? Or you see that a lot with if other advisors you talk to? And is that obviously, you view it differently? What's their perspective versus your perspective with why would I invest conservatively in an IRA versus a Roth IRA?
Yeah, and again, it's a very prevalent thought in the industry. That advisor is not alone in that way of thinking. I've heard it so many times that you want to allocate your higher growth stocks to your Roth and then maybe your lower conservative dividend paying stocks to your IRA because the Roth stocks are going to grow more. And again, my rebuttal to that is why aren't you putting all of your money into the highest growth opportunities if you know for certain that that is going to be the way it plays out? With more return potential usually comes more risk. And so there could be a situation where those high growth stocks that you allocated to the Roth because you didn't want to pay taxes on them, they don't go anywhere. They go backwards, and that completely negates the advantages of a Roth. And so you have to be smart in the way you're allocating across your accounts, but don't tell me that you know how the future is going to play out and that you're going to put this money that is going to grow tax free into the highest growth stuff. Okay, if you know that for certain, then just invest all of your money in that and make more money regardless of the tax situation.
I'm I'm gonna riff on this a little bit. So when you look at some of the big asset managers out there as well, a lot of them, they've been calling for international to outperform US stocks over the past 5, 10 years. They've called for reversions from growth to value. And if you had all of your money in a Roth in value stocks and international stocks over these last couple years, you probably weren't too happy. So that's the only thing I'll say. But again, I agree.
And what's even more ironic about that is those same asset managers will tell people don't time the market. They'll say don't time the market, but try to time it a little bit with how you're allocating in your traditional and your Roth because we know that international has a better chance to outperform. Okay, then you're just telling you're speaking out of two sides of your mouth where you're saying don't try to time the best performing assets or don't try to time the market, but also do try to time it by allocating more into this in your Roth. So again, there's a lot of common wisdom in this industry, and if you just dig a little bit below the surface, like, it doesn't make sense from a common sense perspective.
We should have just a whole podcast on that topic itself. We
On what? I mean, destroying narratives that are present.
talking about basically what are the headlines that people are saying or investment managers are saying or advisors, and why is this maybe not true all the time, or why should you take this with a grain of salt? So that'll lead to my next question for Pat. Maximizing Social Security and taking Social Security. Everybody's always like, how do I maximize it? When should I take it? But there's so many factors when it comes to Social Security, whether it's 62 or 70 or somewhere in between. And there's qualitative and quantitative factors, such as, hey, we need the money to bridge the gap. And other times where it's like, hey, we have a really low spending in our early 60s because have a project or we're, planning a big trip when we hit 70. When should people think about taking it, and why should they take it earlier versus later? What's your mindset with that?
Well, we could do a whole podcast series on this. Oh man, so this one gets me going a little bit because it's such a big decision for people to make. I heard a interesting stat. It was 11,000 people turned 62 every single day. If you extrapolate that over a week, I mean, you could fill an NFL football stadium with the amount of people that are turning 62 and have this big decision of should you tap into Security early? Should you take it at your full retirement age, 67 for many? Or should you delay and get those additional credits out to 70? It's a tough conversation, and where I really like to have a robust conversation with clients on this one, because I think it's crucial. A lot of times when you look at like financial planning software, right? And we use some great software ourselves, but like you plug in the numbers, and the majority of times, the numbers will say delay to 70 because couple different things. They look at people's like break even of, hey, if you take it at 67 versus 70, right? Like how long, if you take it early, how long do you need to live to then capitalize on that decision? The other thing is that a lot of times these financial planning softwares, they are running life expectancy to 95. They are running life expectancy to 100. And we don't have that many people in our book that are 95. Finally, the other thing that is really not taken into account is that if you start taking Social Security, if you delay Social Security, then how are you going to plug that gap in income? You're plugging it from pulling it out of the portfolio. So then from there, it's not taking into account that loss of income from the portfolio and the growth that it could have had. So in terms of how I like to approach it, I like to be very realistic in terms of life expectancy. We can look at the national life expectancy, but then also like I want to understand, and it could be an uncomfortable conversation, but what does life expectancy look like for you and your family? And how's your health? And let's run a couple different scenarios to see how this would actually, play out as opposed to just saying you're going to live to 95. The other thing that I like to take into account is like, let's look at the trade offs. So if you need to plug that gap in income, let's look at the distributions that you need to take from your account. And then let's look at what that account looks like longer term. Because a lot of times we work with clients that have legacy goals, for example. And if they delay Social Security, that means more is taken out of their account. That might mean that less is left to their beneficiaries. So there is just this again, we can go so deep on this. But again, I think it's such an important discussion. And that's what it is. It's a discussion, Andrew, because it's a gamble on how long you're going to live. It's a gamble on life expectancy. So have a robust conversation, look at the pros, and then look at the trade-off that you're looking to make. And then from there, make an educated decision. And at that point, I always say to people, once you make the decision, just go with it. And then stop like thinking about what could have been. Because at that point, once you turn it on, you ain't turning it off.
And to tie it back into the question which we let off the episode with is $1 million enough? Well, it depends. It depends on how much you're going to get from Social Security because that doesn't factor into your $1 million nest egg. And what are some other sources of stable income? Do you have a pension? Do you have any annuities that you're going to annuitize and get a stream of income from? So when we're asking, is $1 million enough for me to live on? We're assuming that $1 million is in investable assets. Maybe it doesn't factor in household or the equity in your house. So there are so many different things that can be discussed when discussing how much money should you have in an investment portfolio. Social Security is one of them. You mentioned longevity. What's your personal health history? What is your family's health history? There are so many different things for us to talk about that it is impossible for us to say yes or no, $1 million, you're good, $1 million, you're not. And again, it's not that you can or cannot live off of $1 million. It's do you want to live a certain lifestyle that your investment assets will allow you to live?
Yeah. And I said this so many times on this podcast, but it's also like that is also like financial plans will change. So you can't just run a static financial plan and get your Monte Carlo scenario, analysis and be like, I'm good to go. Cause like life is going to evolve. Things are going to happen. And that's why it's so important, like to continue to revisit this plan as things change to make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position possible moving forward.
And to go off what Pat said earlier, people can think of it like you're curating your income. Like you have a big income project for the year, and you have a whole suite of tools to use from Social Security to different income streams to different accounts. Maybe you have 5 different accounts. And so you're looking at, all right, which tool am I going to use this year? Am I going to use 2 of the tools, one of the tools, all the tools to build my income out for kind of the income project for the year and strategically use that so you avoid the taxes from using all the tools at the same time. So one thing too that's really talked about a lot in the industry, and Pat, we've talked about this a little bit, but short term midterm, long-term buckets. Do you use those? Should you use those? What does it look like in a planning scenario?
Yeah, I'll let David take this one.
So we do look at that as how we're constructing a portfolio, and to be honest, the philosophy behind it is one where we're leaning into a client's bias of yeah, looking at how much money that you need for a certain period of time, and then not wanting that specific bucket of money. It's called mental accounting, right? We all know that a dollar in one investment or one account just buys just as much stuff as a dollar in another one. And so if we say to somebody that these dollars are meant for your next couple of years, it allows that level of comfort to come into a client's life because they know that that money is quote unquote safe in something that's not going to fluctuate a lot in value, or it's in a bond that's going to mature in a certain year. And so it allows them now to be comfortable with their overall allocation. So let's use an example of 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% in bonds. If of that 40% in bonds, we have it allocated into something that is going to be safe for the next 12 to 18 months in a money market fund. And then we have bond funds that mature in the next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road to meet those spending requirements. It allows our clients to now withstand some of the market fluctuations that are bound to happen over time. And so it is it is our way of kind of approaching not only the dollars and cents of what we do, but also the emotional impact of realizing that our clients are paying attention to their account balances. And if we can sidestep some of that emotion to the point where they're able to continue to live their life, I think that's a win for all parties involved because we're not necessarily changing their investment allocation. We are just shifting it into something that is going to readily meet their spending needs in those periods of time.
Yeah, and I know this is talked about a lot, but there is this like big psychological shift from like when you're working to then when you retire and you have like one bucket of money that is going to fuel the rest of maybe like your 30, 40 year retirement. I've seen it kind of with my parents too. When they retired, they were almost a little afraid to be able to actually spend money out of their account just because of the difference in having to source their income from their hard-earned savings. And the bucket strategy that, David put together has really kind of helped them open up and be able to have a little bit more flexibility. And what I would just say is like more confidence in spending from their portfolio, but also being able to put their heads down at night and not always have to worry about like what's happening in the markets and how am I going to source my next income stream. I think it's a great strategy, and it just helps from a psychological perspective.
I think people are getting that there is no one size fits all with $1 million. There's so many factors that go into it from where do you live, what do you spend, what's your social security, where your account's allocated. So there's a lot of different factors that go in. And when we do seminars, Pat, you lead it off always with nobody in here has the same situation. Everybody here is different. And that is just so important. And so if you could give Pat even just maybe one or two or even three rules of thumb or just general things to think about, they're kind of like key points to generating income in retirement. And is this enough? What would you say to somebody on the street if you had kind of an elevator pitch to give them?
An elevator pitch, let's say like they are preparing for, call it retirement, and they want to make sure that like, they're ready to rock. First off, I would just say I'm going to keep these kind of high level. Is just have clarity and organization within your life, and we tend to help out with that. But a lot of times, what I see is that clients have multiple accounts spread across multiple institutions, and at that point, like you have no clarity in terms of what your nest egg is, how your nest egg is going to be tapped, and how it's going to be taxed. So just create some clarity and some organization. That's the best place to start. And then from there, really start to think about like, what does comfort mean for you? We'll bring it back to the beginning of this conversation. You need to have an understanding of the lifestyle that you're looking to live so that you understand how much you may need from your portfolio along with your other sources of potential stable income. And then that will be kind of your guiding North Star to see if you may have the ability to retire. And then finally, like, don't forget about the other things that are really top of mind. We talked a little bit about Social Security, But then healthcare, I always bring that up. It's a big decision that a lot of people have to make at 65. And you need to make sure that you have a plan going into that so that you're adequately covered, and that, healthcare expenses don't throw a wrench in the overall lifestyle that you're looking to live.
And it's such a cop out to whenever anybody asks these types of questions, the only right answer, the only correct answer is to say it depends, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hear that because they want answers and they want to know for sure. And we can just say it depends and then walk away and leave them feeling dissatisfied. But that is the truth of the matter is it depends on a lot of different variables. And what we do here as a firm is we try to work through those variables. We try to create investment strategies, financial plans that are, as you mentioned, robust, but also adaptive, flexible, being able to adjust to whatever the market has to offer us, being able to adjust to whatever the tax situation or life or anything. And if you have a very what would be referred to as a fragile financial plan, the smallest disruption can cause a lifetime of pain. So what you want to do as you enter into those retirement years, or even if you're already there, is to make sure that you have a robust financial plan, a robust investment strategy that allows you to adapt to any changes that occur because we don't know what the future is going to look like. We have no idea. We can guess, but there's no path that is a guarantee moving forward. And so we want to be able to give our clients that comfort in knowing that whatever happens, we're ready for it.
Pat, any closing thoughts?
I think David took the cake there. Love it. I'll say that.
Awesome. Well, we give a lot of stuff to munch on. Like David said, there's no one size fits all and no silver bullet. But knowing kind of what to think about and your mental heuristics on how to go about planning, preparing, and executing retirement is really important for not only in your 50s and 60s, but beyond. As stuff gets more complicated with RMDs and healthcare, just knowing where everything's at, organizing it, and having a really, really good system and plan in place, keeping kind of the extra things in mind that could sabotage the plan potentially, depending on what you're doing with it and what your mindset is.
Yeah, so that's a good spot to end. Thanks, Andrew, for jumping on and moderating. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, leave us a comment on YouTube, reach us however that the internet gives you the opportunity to do so. And we will be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Retirement Done Right. To learn more, visit us at contwealth.com.